There's a phrase that says in the middle of a criminal there's a place where they feel eternally innocent. Perhaps this helps to explain why these great murderers manage to commit their crimes without a trace of remorse. However, there are murders that go beyond conscience and involve the absolute deformation of the human being. We are talking about murderers who devour their victims and enjoy the whole process, as they consider it a way to keep the people they choose to perform their horrible rituals within themselves. There is no doubt that their minds hide the worst monsters of the human race. But of all the cases that have been recorded on our planet, there are 10 cannibal killers who have managed to terrify entire countries. Do you think you are brave enough to meet them? Then it's time to start. Number 10. The Florida Terror. Since the 60s, Otis Toole and Henry Lee kept the state of Florida under a state of absolute terror. Both came to be credited with the murder of more than 108 people, and their outlandish murders went down in history for the macabre practices they used in each one of them. Otis Toole was nicknamed the Jacksonville Cannibal, and according to his partner's testimony, every time he got a particularly interesting victim, he would turn them into cooking ingredients by pouring them into pans and simmering them as if it were a barbecue. After several years, Otis came to confess that he enjoyed eating the ribs of his victims and drinking their blood, although he did not always eat the people he killed, as his twisted mind only enjoyed cooking them and then throwing them to the dogs in the streets. Number 9. A plumbing problem. Between 1955 and 1976, 14 people were murdered in Germany in a systematic and well-premeditated way. The person responsible for these acts was none other than Joachim Kroll, better known as the Ruhr Hunter, or the Ruhr Cannibal because of his modus operandi. For 20 years, this serial killer selected his victims very well. They were usually young girls between 17 and 19 years old, mostly women, and on every occasion after dismembering them, he ingested pieces of their flesh. Years later, Kroll would claim that his acts were out of necessity, as he didn't have enough money to buy food. During these statements, he also confessed that he had cannibalized children between the ages of 3 and 4. In fact, after police conducted a thorough investigation of Kroll's home, it was discovered that the kitchen pipes were filled with guts, and the kitchen was found to contain perverse remains of human flesh that Kroll intended to eat for dinner that night. Number 8. The Russian Shadow. Few memories cause as much commotion in Russia as that of Andrei Chikatilo, better known as the Butcher of Rostov. The first victim of the Soviet serial killer was 9-year-old Lena Zakotnova in 1978. From that moment on, the number of victims grew by dozens, and the total numbers of murders he carried out is unknown. Andrei usually hunted people at train stations. Many times he would look for some way to lure them into the forest, and there he would perform his horrible rituals, which consisted of raping, torturing, and dismembering his victims. However, throughout his life, Andrei Chikatilo never admitted to having been a cannibal, until the end of his life when he confessed that he had completely devoured the flesh of Larissa Tachenko, a 17-year-old girl who aroused in him so much lust that, according to his words, he wanted to keep her inside himself forever. Number 7. The Old Age Murder. Those who know Tamara Samsonova before 2015 would never have imagined that the calm and kind face of a 68-year-old woman was hiding a serial killer that was like very few the world has ever known. Tamara was an older woman who went from rest to homicide in the middle of her retirement. Her victims were mostly acquaintances or friends from her country's elderly circle. For several years, she was known for murdering women over 70 in secret locations. Then, without any remorse, she would walk around the neighborhood with black plastic bags in which she carried the chopped up bodies of the old women. The most curious thing is that all the people close to Tamara had disappeared. It happened to many of her friends and even with her husband, but the body of the victims was never found in none of these cases. After several inspections of her home, it was discovered that Tamara kept human flesh stored in her refrigerator, as well as several specific parts that she put in the black bags every time she committed a murder. Number 6. The Genesee River Killer. Arthur Shawcross. You may not be familiar with this name, but he was responsible for taking the lives of 14 people between 1972 and 1989. His grisly fame was so great that he's been immortalized in several heavy metal and rock songs, although his demented ideas are nothing to applaud. His first murders occurred in New York, when he managed to abduct 2 children and cut them to pieces in the bathroom of his home. Sometime later, he became a killer of prostitutes, dismembering about 10 of them. If the authorities were slow in tracking him down, it was because after each murder, he cooked their corpses, crushed their bones, and threw the leftovers to the pack of dogs that slept in his house. According to research, Arthur developed the habits of cannibalism in the Vietnam War, and by the time he returned from that cruel conflict, his body had developed a need that he satisfied with insatiable regularity. Number 5. A peculiar cause. Very few serial killers have managed to cause as much controversy as the Englishman Robert Maudsley. This unusual criminal woke up one morning with the sole purpose of murdering pedophiles. So he managed to penetrate the networks of this type of men, then befriended several of them and strangled them in alleys and cars without anyone discovering him. Since his capture, English society has questioned whether he is really a murderer or a hero, since for many his cause is just. However, the debate was silenced after authorities discovered that Robert murdered 2 fellow inmates in prison and devoured part of their faces, and, as some claim, part of their brains. Number 4. The Milwaukee Cannibal. When it comes to cannibals, the name Jeffrey Dahmer manages to outshine many. This serial killer took the lives of 17 young men and many other children between 1978 and 1991. His method was extremely macabre. He usually drugged his victims and then strangled them. Once they died, he dismembered their corpses and then had sex with them while chewing their flesh. This horrifying human beast was caught by the police, and upon investigating his home, they discovered dismembered body parts, furniture made of human bones, photographs of naked and dismembered men, human parts stored in the refrigerator, and a barrel of hydrochloric acid with which he dissolved the remaining body parts of his victims. Number 3. Albert Fish. Sometimes trust is a murder weapon, and this is something the Budd family discovered when they let Albert Fish into their home. This serial killer managed to be welcomed by each member of the household as he murdered and subsequently cannibalized them without anyone finding out. His first murder was the 8-year-old Grace Budd, whom he fed on for 9 consecutive days. This murder was particularly disturbing as the girl was first asphyxiated, then chopped into pieces, and preserved with a series of garnishes in the refrigerator of Albert Fish, who was serving himself some of Grace during all those days. Albert would continue his murder and cannibalism over time until he was caught, tried, and sentenced to the electric chair in the late 1930s. Number 2. Film inspiration. You're probably familiar with the slasher style of movies in which a serial killer manages to annihilate the characters with a withering knife. This genre emerged in the 1970s and was largely inspired by Ed Gein, a shy, quiet old man who lived on a farm far from civilization. Ed Gein had major problems with women, especially his mother, who lived in his house. These problems led Gein to kill a couple of women in cold blood and use their skin as a mask. If the story sounds familiar, it is because it inspired the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But far from fiction, Ed Gein kept trophies of his victims, especially the women's private parts. In addition, he made ornaments with human flesh and bones and also fed himself with some parts of their bodies, which helped him to satisfy his lust. When the police went to his farm, they found the decapitated and disemboweled bodies of several of his victims. Additionally, it was discovered that this killer desecrated graves and dressed with body parts he took from the corpses in the cemetery. Number 1. The food of friendship. Another of the world's lesser-known cannibals can be found in the figure of Peter Bryan, a schizophrenic man who murdered a young shopkeeper named Nisha Sheth in 1993 because she refused to have sex with him. Peter beat his victim with a hammer until her body was unrecognizable, but he immediately turned himself into the police and was quickly admitted to the Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. Peter stayed in the psychiatric for many years, and after showing significant progress, he was released under certain conditions and surveillance, which of course failed to prevent him from committing one of his most famous crimes. Shortly after his release from the hospital, Peter was reunited with his childhood best friend, Brian Cherry, and they began living together. For a while, the police seemed convinced that Peter had changed, but everything became really scary when the neighbors reported Brian's absence after several weeks. When the police entered the apartment, they found a bloody hammer and the shredded and decomposing body of Brian Cherry, although it was only his torso and head, since the rest had been cooked and eaten by Peter, who claimed that his friend was delicious after frying and covering him with butter. These chilling stories sound like something out of a horror book, but they are true cases that posterity will always remember with unstoppable dread. Just like these cannibals, there are other types of serial killers and some crimes that have shocked entire countries. And even now that time has moved on, they still awaken the worst nightmares. Are you capable of meeting them? Then it's time to continue and discover new mysteries by watching the following videos.